Well, it looks like it's recording. Hi, I'm Bob.
I'm Eve.
Yeah, and you know us from the Virtual Skeptics. This is kind of like a mini Virtual Skeptics,
Or pseudo-virtual skeptics.
pseudo skeptics.
But not virtual pseudo-skeptics. There's a
She's
difference.
already lost me. This is going to be a long, short little show. So, we have had some disasters. Tim
Was eaten by a hurricane.
was eaten by a hurricane.
Well, he lost power.
And so he is not here to pilot the ship. We have tried doing this live on YouTube, and YouTube just told us to don't even. So, yeah. But we did want to talk about, and Brian has familial obligations of a parental nature, so he isn't around to run the show for us. And we have a couple of interesting stories that we really wanted to talk about.
Because medieval, yay.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, because they're medieval and because, gives doing the skeptical humanities thing gives us a chance to, talk with some authority about some stuff. And yeah. But we have some interesting, I think we'll have an interesting take on these two stories. It got a lot of coverage. And I think in both cases, people who are really fans of the sciences bit down pretty hard on them. So the one I was going to do is the Voynich manuscript. You'll know this. This is a, 15th century manuscript, early 15th century manuscript that is...
Gibberish.
It's gibberish. I mean, not even gibberish. It's not even letters. And there's an
Well, no one knows.
Well, yeah.
Sort of the
Well,
point.
yeah. And so it's just there seems to be some sort of script that doesn't correspond to anything we've ever seen before. And
There's
some pictures that look horoscopy, and then some things that look botanical. And yeah, so it
and bathing ladies
and nudies. And so and Eve had the story of.
Well, it's been deciphered. It's deciphered, I'd say, roughly every 5 or 10 minutes.
The Voynich manuscript?
Yeah.
No, okay. So, yeah, the Voynich manuscript is... when they said that the Voynich manuscript has been... the code has been cracked, it's like...
The answer is no.
Again?
No, it hasn't.
They keep cracking... they keep finding Noah's Ark, too. And this is kind of the same kind of quixotic exercise so far. And your story is...
Viking warrior woman! Woo!
On the moon.
Yeah, actually in Sweden.
Okay. But basically just as remote. Anyway, so do you want to start?
I can start.
Okay.
So, according to the headlines, first female Viking warrior proved through DNA. This high-ranking Viking warrior was a woman. DNA evidence proves male Viking warrior was actually female. Famous Viking warrior was a woman, DNA reveals. DNA proves fearsome Viking warrior was a woman. And DNA proves Viking women were powerful warriors. And then, according to the Twitters, where you usually get your most reliable information, science beats gendered assumptions. Viking warrior confirmed by genetic analysis to be woman. And although continuously occurring in art as well as poetry, women warriors have generally been dismissed as mythological phenomena. But thanks to science, we now have proof that at least one Swedish Viking warrior was a woman.
Can I jump in? And big science fan here, but, come on. Give us some credit. And by us, I mean the humanities. And by the humanities, I mean Eve.
Okay. This all concerns a short article, really quite short article, in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology by Charlotte Hendenstierna Jonsson, Anna Kjellstrom, and others, called A Female Viking Warrior Confirmed by Genomics.
Oh, here, boink.
In their abstract under objectives, the authors say, the objective of this study has been to confirm the sex and the affinity of an individual buried in a well-furnished warrior grave, BJ 581, in the Viking Age town of Birka, Sweden.
Well pronounced.
Thank you. Sweden's not that hard to pronounce.
It's true.
Previous
it's the little victories.
All right. Previous osteological studies of the bones, one performed in the 70s and one published just last year, sort of still waiting on an interlibrary loan for it, by Anna Kjellstrom, co-author of the current study, suggested that the bones belonged to a woman. So a DNA analysis of a tooth and a humerus bone confirmed that the individual did have 2 X chromosomes and no Y chromosomes at all. And there are humans like that. They're called women. DNA testing and strontium isotope testing further showed that her genetic affinity is close to present-day Northern Europeans and within Sweden to the southern and south central region. Nevertheless, these strontium values are not conclusive as to whether she was of local or non-local origin. However, change between the first molar and the second molar suggested she moved between the formation of those 2 molars. Some articles have suggested that this confirms Viking-like mobility, but possibly as an 8-year-old, based on molar
8-year-olds can be pretty vicious.
Well, absolutely.
Raiding and pillaging? Don't know.
Yeah, they would if they could. So that's all fine, right? The science seems fine. She's biologically female. Her bones look female. They're long, slender, and gracile, or the long bones are. And she's associated with a chamber grave that includes a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, a battle knife, sometimes called a bottle knife in certain articles, which is odd, 2 shields, a mare, a stallion, and gaming pieces. So she's a Viking warrior, right? Right? Viking warrior woman, right? That.
Yeah.
We should probably stop now then.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Wait. But she must be a Viking warrior woman because they call her a Viking warrior woman repeatedly throughout the 7-page article. Further, they say the gaming pieces indicate, quote, knowledge of tactics and strategy, stressing the buried individual's role as a high-ranking officer. Also, the goods and the horses are worthy of an individual with responsibilities concerning strategy and battle tactics. Okay, the problem here isn't with the science. It's with the interpretation of the data and some information that is left out. Horses and game pieces mean she was an expert in strategery and therefore a high-ranking officer?
I've played checkers, so that's why I did so well in the first Gulf War.
Right. So that's highly speculative, and it's also stated as if it's fact. Not everyone who owns a chess set and a horse is a general. I'm pretty sure that's true. But what's more concerning is the information that's left out or dealt with only very, very briefly. Reports in the media and reactions on social media have really played up the idea that science has proven the sexist assumptions of historians and archaeologists to be wrong. And I'm not saying...
Wrong! Go ahead.
And I'm not saying that historians and archaeologists have never made sexist assumptions, especially, like, in this case, we're talking about going back to the 19th century. But here's something kind of important that's relegated to the article's supplemental information. In the 1970s, osteologist Barrett Vilkins identified the bones as likely female. Quote, however, due to the fact that some finds and osteological materials from Birka have lost their contextual provenance.
They meant to say provenance.
During the years of storage, Vilkins' observations were never commented on. Nevertheless, except for the missing cranium, the documented remains correspond with the documentation by Stolpa from 1889. Now, there's a lot of information here. One, they confuse providence and provenance, or Microsoft Word did. More importantly, though, Birka contains around 3,000 burials. Slightly more than a third of those burials have been excavated, and most of those excavations occurred in the 19th century. Archaeological methods have improved somewhat in the last 100 years, as have storage standards.
They don't just go through them and take all the shit?
No, they don't, and they just don't go, well, here's some bones, and there's some bones over there.
Bone party, woo!
You so almost hit me in the face.
I'm sorry.
The material from the Birka graves is apparently in rather a haphazard or higgledy-piggledy state. So there have been...
Battle-higgledy, battle-piggledy.
Sure. So there have been and may still be legitimate questions about whether these bones, though at some point they were labeled BJ581, whether they're actually the right bones. The authors acknowledge that, but again, only in the supplemental material. And then they explain why they believe these are the right bones, but very briefly. And they really need more explanation and more evidence, especially since they say the remains correspond with the documentation, except for the missing cranium. Now, if the doctor told you you're fine after your accident, except for the missing cranium, that missing cranium would probably be kind of important to you, or it would if you had a cranium and could sort of understand what was being said to you. Evidence that doesn't fit their hypothesis is buried in the supplemental material and dismissed without sufficient discussion. And that's not how science is supposed to work, and it's really not how scholarship is supposed to work of any kind whatsoever. Second, the authors don't give a very detailed description of the bones. Apparently, Kjellström doesn't in her earlier article either. They don't say how tall she was. They don't say anything about muscular development consistent with a warrior. And muscle development does leave marks on bones.
And as does, having a hard life. That shows up in the bones as well.
Right.
I've seen enough Time Team to know this.
Right. They do say the long bones are thin, slender, and gracile, which is consistent with a woman, but less consistent with a high-ranking warrior, because women, particularly older women, this woman is not that old, I believe in her 30s, but ones who have done a lot of hard labor, some of those aspects are less marked. The bones become less gracile. In the supplemental information, the authors mention 2 other weapons graves whose occupants were female. One of them in particular is noteworthy. A woman's bones were found in 1900 in Hedmark, Norway. This woman was buried as a fully equipped warrior with a double-edged sword, an axe, a spear, 5 arrowheads, a shield, bridles, fragments of a whetstone, and probably a file. The bones were of a slender and petite young woman between 18 and 20 years old. The authors say, quote, "It has been argued..."
Just squirting the cat, people. Just squirting the cat.
"It has been argued that despite her outfit, the slender young woman's hand could never have been large enough to reach around the grip of the sword, and thus she would have been unable to handle the sword in real combat. But this must be open to question." Well, okay. Question it. Give me evidence that it's not true. They've simply dismissed a significant practical objection without offering any evidence to counter it whatsoever. This tells us nothing beyond the author's desires to say this woman who was buried with weapons must have been a warrior, and so is our other woman in Sweden. As for the woman from Birka, they say that no traumatic or pathological injuries are present. Further, they say, the skeletal remains in grave BJ581 did not exhibit signs of antemortem or perimortem trauma which could support the notion that the individual had been a warrior.
Ah! Earthquake, that's all.
However, they say...
Oh, yeah. Don't worry about it. Technical. Tim, where are you? Brian. Oh, God. Okay.
However, they argue, contrary to what could be expected, weapon-related wounds and trauma in general are not...
I really enjoy this. Okay, sorry.
Are not common in inhumation burials at Birka, e.g., 2 out of 49 confirmed males showed signs of sharp force trauma. A similarly low frequency is noted at contemporaneous cemeteries in Scandinavia. Traces of violent trauma are more common in Viking Age mass burials.
So a bunch of hacked up bodies thrown into a pit?
Sometimes, yeah. Well, okay. Maybe not all weapons graves are actually warriors, regardless of their biological sex. Maybe the weapons are a sign of status and rank, but not necessarily the rank of warrior.
And this is actually, I think this is like the most interesting idea that comes out of this, is that what happens if we have been misinterpreting, I mean, that seems like a possibility. Everybody who's buried with a sword, I believe the authors say at one point, if this was a male in this grave, you'd never ask a question whether or not they were a warrior. And
I'm not even sure that's entirely true. But
maybe
it's certainly more true.
But because it's kind of, it conforms to what we would already expect.
Right.
And what happens if this is, this is an assumption that needs to be questioned more rigorously? Perhaps the swords are bestowed on, leaders, regardless of whether or not how much success they've had in battle personally, or experience they've had in battle personally. That's a cool thought that opens up more possibilities.
Right. Judith Jesch, professor of Viking Studies at the University of Nottingham.
Is she in the Department of Viking Studies?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Wrote a blog post in which she articulated a lot of the problems I had with the paper, and I believe she may be my spirit animal. She says, apparently, the warriors of these graves were either so good that they were never injured, or perhaps they weren't really warriors at all. According to the authors, our results caution against sweeping interpretations based on archaeological context and preconceptions. They do not seem to recognize that if they take this principle to its logical conclusion, the interpretation of this and many other graves as warrior graves is thereby called into question. They can't have their cake and eat it too. In other words, the authors are skeptical about archaeological contexts when it comes to biological sex. And, as well they should be. But they are not skeptical of archaeological contexts when those contexts support their hypotheses. Jesch further notes that although the authors point out that previous arguments have neglected intersectional perspectives, they do not really pursue alternative explanations regarding BJ 581 either. Was it possible, for example, for a biological woman to have been buried with full warrior accoutrement even if she'd not been a warrior in life? After all, archaeologists are always cautioning us that the dead don't bury themselves, and they often seem not to like interpretations in which the deceased grave goods are taken as representing their roles in life. But such perspectives do not seem to be applied here. They want the woman to be a warrior, so the scientific analysis makes her a woman, and her archaeological context makes her a warrior. And this is not to say that the study isn't interesting and worthwhile. And of course, we shouldn't automatically assume that a weapons burial belongs to a male warrior. If possible, an osteological examination should be performed. If practical, DNA analysis should be performed, although such tests can be prohibitively expensive, so they're not going to be performed every time a skeleton is found. But there are genuine questions that have not been sufficiently addressed regarding these bones. The provenance is a problem, and just as we can't assume weapons graves contain male remains, we can't necessarily assume weapons graves contain warriors.
She froze up there for a second, folks.
The article also makes vague references to historical records, narratives, and poetry, and it ends with a translated passage from the Eddic poem Atlamal about a woman, Gudrun Gjukadottir.
It's a charming name.
Yeah, it's better in German where she's a Gebietschung. Anyway, she takes up a sword to defend her brothers. However, Gudrun is not a historical character, and though she uses violence and weapons on occasion, including killing her own children and serving them to her husband, she's not a warrior like her rival Brynhild the Valkyrie. Jesh points out that while the article has 10 authors, they have chosen not to involve any specialist in language or texts, despite the references to narratives and poetry.
Expert in texts.
Well, Jesh definitely is. Yeah. She says the impression given is that the authors consider that no special expertise is required to handle this kind of evidence, unlike bones or DNA or archaeological finds. And the confusion over texts and narratives is even more apparent in many of the media stories about the article. Bioarchaeologist Christina Kilgrove writes in Forbes magazine that historical records from the early Middle Ages mention women fighting alongside men, and artistic works depict this as well. But for the most part, these ideas have been dismissed as mythological, not based in reality. There are indeed certainly some works of art, especially figurines and amulets, that show women in battle garb. And there are certainly stories about warrior women, shield maidens and valkyries particularly. But Kilgrove is not very specific when she talks about texts. What historical records is she talking about? I haven't seen them. The warrior women always appear in works of very dubious historicity, and that's to put it mildly.
The Valkyrie and the Beanstalk?
Yeah, that's the one. It's actually more like Sleeping Beauty. That really is.
Oh, really?
The story of Brynhild.
Okay.
Being bored to sleep by Odin, who uses a thorn. Anyway.
There's a whole big thing, I'm sure.
Yeah. Various articles have said that historians and other scholars, usually in the humanities, have dismissed female Viking warriors as mythological, but there's a good reason that literary depictions of Norse female warriors are considered legendary or mythological. They appear in mythological and legendary contexts.
Okay.
And so it's not just dismissing, there's an actual body of knowledge there. Finally, I find it a bit dispiriting that people, including self-proclaimed feminists, are only interested in the lives of Viking Age women when those women are said to have lived lives that are typically masculine. Are Viking Age women only interesting when they're essentially Viking Age men with boobs?
Do you want an answer? Probably not. Probably not. Yeah, probably not. Okay. So kind of what we're saying here is hold your horses. Yeah.
And if you have horses to hold, you're an expert in strategy.
It just occurred to me that we are so bad at internet. I think that we may have recorded this in vertical mode.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
You should have said something because I'm slow. It takes me a while to get there. Okay, so the other thing that we wanted to talk about was something that got a lot of traction among skeptics, including Michael Shermer seemed to endorse it online, that the Voynich manuscript has been deciphered. Okay, so this is yet again, a 15th century, early 15th century manuscript, Eastern maybe, that
Eastern European.
Yeah, Eastern. Not Far East. Yeah, Eastern European. That has all sorts of illustrations that seem like they might line up with a sort of magic book or astrological or a couple of different types of genres seem to kind of be present. And the text doesn't really seem to be anything like a text. There are no recognizable letters really. And when you look at the word length, it doesn't vary like a language,
words,
like words do. Yeah. So those ratios are often it's strange, and I think that there's a reason why it's considered to be a very peculiar manuscript, and it's because it's frickin' peculiar. It doesn't seem to have any direct ancestors. There seems to be how long we had, over 100 years, something like over 100 years.
Oh, since it was discovered.
Yeah. Maybe 1912, something like that. And it resides currently at the Beinecke Research Library at Yale, which is awesome.
But has some pretty dubious stuff.
There are a couple of things in there.
Finland map.
Yeah. But my cat is just terrified I'm going to squirt it again. Mm-hmm. And I might. So, he hates me now. And I'm forgiven. So this new theory was appeared in an article in the Times Literary Supplement, which is a respected book review, not scholarly, but well-regarded, popular outlet that you'd expect to be well edited. And the theory is, I think that what it has going for it is that, like the Voynich manuscript, the theory is indecipherable. Which makes it hard to refute when you're just like, what the hell are you talking about?
But to be have gotten such acclaim for this theory from all over the place and various skeptics, this must be a very renowned medievalist. Right?
Well, actually, he's a guy who's a muralist.
A linguist?
War artist.
Cryptologist?
Cryptographer?
Yeah,
Neither of them. He has a book about screenwriting.
But no screenwriting credits.
As far as I can tell, yeah. So, it's tough to say. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody who's not in the field can't have new insights. And that can be really valuable if somebody from a different discipline shows up and they are looking at a problem from a different way. A lot of interesting, software problems can be solved that way, or, engineering problems can be solved that way. However, I'm not entirely convinced this guy knows what he's talking about. So his main idea seems to be that there are a couple of markings in there that look like ligatures. And ligatures are shortenings of several letters.
They're also useful if you want to strengthen some.
Well, that's
it might be a
different type of ligature. But yeah, there are two letters that are kind of bound together, or maybe even more. Can you have more in a ligature? I don't see why I couldn't. But so you have, and it's abbreviation essentially that can stand for very common words, and you see it in some medieval manuscripts. However,
you see it various shortenings a lot in medieval Latin. Not ligatures quite so much, but an ampersand or certain types of ampersand are
it's an E and a T fused together, and so that would be et, which is Latin for and
then squished together words, letters like the AE and archaeologist, or that's how it used to be spelled. Those are ligatures as well.
And so he comes to this project. He said he was asked by a TV show or producers or someone in television to take a look at the Voynich manuscript to see whether or not it's a forgery. That's a phrase that he uses himself, not in the article, but in another thing. And he says he brings unique skills that clearly nobody else has had before.
None whatsoever?
Well, he says he has an eye for narrative. Well, okay.
That's fine if you have a script that you can make a narrative out of.
Yeah. And so what he's kind of done...
And by the way, as far as the authenticity, it's been carbon dated. They've looked at the ink. It's old.
Yeah.
Definitely the parchment is old.
That was the first thing that seemed weird to me, is when he said he was asked to see whether or not it's a fake. It was just like...
Well, it could be a medieval forgery or a medieval hoax. That's a possibility.
And that's a real thing. And we're talking, or I was talking to Brian Dunning online, and he expressed, the idea, well, that it's some sort of... was used by some bullshitter to bullshit money out of someone. And that's definitely a possibility. You want to impress someone with the source of your ancient wisdom and knowledge, something that has astrological signs and an herbal in it. It's a possibility, but I don't see that it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And I'm not even sure that's...
It's a really expensive possibility, though, because that's a lot of...
I was thinking about that.
Darned parchment.
That's a lot of calf skin. It is, and when you're talking about skinning that many calves, you're talking about a huge material investment.
You're talking about a monastery.
And it seems there are a couple of different hands in it, or in the drawings. Mm-hmm. But you're talking about a significant outlay. But on the other side, if I can see someone being taken in by a charlatan. Someone with authority, someone with money, and these people working at the direction of the charlatan. But that's really, I'm telling a story here. I don't really have any evidence of that other than if it's a hoax, it's a damn expensive hoax. Another realistic possibility is that it is somebody who has graphophilia, somebody who writes compulsively, even if it doesn't make sense.
Also, loonbat. That's a possibility.
It could be a loonbat. So,
or it could be some sort of cipher.
We haven't figured it out yet. So these are all
except for this guy. This guy figured it out.
This guy is very sure. And what the story that he tells is in the Times Literary Supplement is about how he's kind of like uniquely qualified to recognize this for what it is, given his past experiences and things he's worked on, and has interpreted medieval Latin for TV producers in the past, or what? Okay,
which is great. Although there are entire people who, instead of just parts of people, who do medieval Latin as their job.
Yeah, as their primary specialty.
Scholarly job. Yeah,
and so this guy doesn't seem to have a history in publishing here in this area. And this theory comes out in a well-respected but popular venue, and we're just kind of scratching our heads why. And so I went over to the Times Literary Supplement's webpage, and they have a link to a podcast about this, and they interview Nicholas Gibbs, and it seems to me that the editor, who is one of the presenters on the podcast, he seems to me to be a bit of a believer. Doesn't seem to ask any critical questions, nothing hard. Whereas,
are you kidding?
So what's your problem? So yeah, it was a very. The idea is that this is. He looked at. He was saying that these ligatures, which can stand in for whole words, are highly dependent. Which words they stand for depends on the context. And the context here are the pictures of the plants, the horoscopes, and the naked ladies bathing in a green substance. And so he said, well, this clearly looks like bathing is some sort of medical practice. So he starts looking in medical texts for things that are like it. And, this is another thing. He seems to have reached his conclusion already, which is that this is going to end up being something that confirms his belief that this is a medical book of some sort. And he actually says, I think that this is a medical book for somebody who's in a wealthy household.
The thing is, the associations he makes between the manuscript and other manuscripts, like other herbals, that's not new information.
Yeah.
That's pretty well worn. Other people who are actually experts have pointed many of these things out before.
Yeah, so it's not entirely, yeah.
So his unique input comes from the last two paragraphs?
Well, kind of, yeah. It's so you see about all, he kind of builds himself up for most of the article, and then the last two paragraphs he says, and so, knowing what to look for now, we can clearly see that some of these, and he goes and he looks at the dictionary of ligatures. There's some scholar, I don't know who this was, collected all the ligatures that he'd seen in his career in one book. And that's going to be from lots of manuscripts from lots of different people. And so this guy in the 15th century was using everybody else's ligatures.
Yeah.
That's a problem too. And I wonder if he's not just seeing things that are similar and then running with it.
But, like the original person who brought the manuscript to prominence, who saw the tiny microlines.
Yeah, little tiny like cracks in the vellum and little ink thingies.
Yeah.
Leaching into it and interpret that as actual writing when the human hand isn't dexterous enough to do that. So there are some problems here again, and these are unaddressed by the editor of the Times Literary Supplement. So I'm gonna call that this is the editor of the Times falling for crankery. It happens. As far as I can tell, this guy doesn't really have any expertise. And when he does provide us finally with his translation, he gives us 2 lines, and they're in grammatically incorrect medieval Latin.
Yeah, that is not a good sign.
That's bad. And so one thing
after all his expertise in the Latins.
And one of the things that they say, and by they, I have no idea who that refers to. Pronouns are, they don't really need reference when it's me talking. And by me, I mean, who knows. So, but one of the things that this guy says, that Gibbs says, is that, we don't see any names that we'd expect to see. I guess commonly repeating things like, he gives an example. You got to look at the metadata. You have to, and there is some truth to this. If you were trying to crack a code that, and this is the example he gives, and it actually makes some sort of sense. If you're trying to crack a code in wartime, for instance, you might expect mentions of planes, and that may give you a little bit of information for something to look at. Or something that repeats in coded messages or whatever. And you don't see anything like that in here. And so what he goes on to say is that missing pages, an index is missing that would say what these were originally supposed to treat. It would probably be in Latin.
Well, I'm sure there's quite a lot of evidence for that missing index, right?
There's no index there. That's his evidence that that's what's missing.
Oh, well, yeah.
Well,
and there is evidence of a few leaves missing.
Of missing leaves, but not of the whole...
A whole bunch right at the end.
Yeah, it's just... He's... And so the idea would be like, female, coughing, see page 42. And coughing ginger, and have the name of the problem. I'm crushing your head. It would have like the name of the problem and the name of the remedy, and then you'd go to the right page. And because it had been mentioned in the index, you wouldn't have to mention it on the page. That seems really just so to me. So. But yet it seems to have been picked up by a lot of people, and we just wanted to come out and say, no, not so fast. You got to listen to some humanities people. We're useful.
Yeah, and some experts, instantly just looked at it and went, Oh, no. Oh, no. And
Ars Technica put out a favorable coverage of the thing.
And then went,
And
oh,
then,
wait.
Never mind.
Yeah, and he also just, he never went to look at the manuscript in person.
He never talked to the people
at
at the Beinecke.
He never talked to the people at the Beinecke. There's another article in The Atlantic that's really good about it as well.
Yeah. So
it's a disaster because people linguists, cryptographers, like the Enigma code breakers have looked at this and not been able to crack it.
And there is no doubt in his mind, if you listen to that podcast, and I encourage you to, there's no doubt in his mind that he's gotten it.
Yeah.
And it's just like, this is the confidence of someone who has literally no idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
So that's that. So that was a almost short Virtual Skeptics ish thing
in portrait mode. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that was poorly thought out. We should do this again. I'm just kidding. This is going up as is. And so hopefully we'll see you next week if the storms let Tim and the parents let Brian out. So see you later.